Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco, sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
On November the 17th, 2006, police in the German city of Cologne searched the vehicle of a 47-year-old truck driver suspected of murder. What they found inside his cab was a collection of gruesome memorabilia.
When they searched the lorry, they found evidence that this was not a one-off act. There were Polaroid photographs of other victims. There were trophies in the lorry.
The driver was a man named Volker Eckert. His arrest brought an end to a 32-year career of murder.
Eckert was somebody who became much more skilled at committing murder the longer that his killing went on. So he had access, he had opportunity, and he really honed his killing routine.
The police had no idea just how many victims this long-distance serial killer may have claimed.
There will always be the question, whether 6 dead women, or whether 13, or even 19, or even more.
Back then, he was just beginning his brutal career. I was incredibly lucky.
Volker Eckert had terrorized Europe for decades and become one of the world's most evil killers. It was a case that spanned 5 European countries. When 47-year-old truck driver Volker Eckert was apprehended on the 17th of November 2006, the police had no idea of the extent of his history of murder. Eckert had been on the run for 2 weeks after killing a Bulgarian prostitute in the north of Spain. When detectives searched the cab of his articulated lorry, they found photographs and hair clippings from 5 women whom he'd abducted and murdered across Europe. Eckert's defense lawyer was Alexander Schmidtgall.
He confessed immediately after he got arrested by the police. You have this quite often when you have serial killers or when you have people who have a burden carried with them for a long time. It was like a relief for him to speak with someone and to tell what he did. Yeah? So it was like a confession in a church for him.
Schmidtgall couldn't believe the person he was talking to was the same cold-blooded killer he'd read about in the police files.
So you think there's a monster in front of you, but the actual communication with him, he was a very normal guy. He was like someone selling you life insurance. He was nothing special.
Prosecutors wanted to find out what was going on inside the head of Volker Eckert. He was sent off to be assessed by forensic psychologist Professor Norbert Nedopil.
We came from prison, guided by 2 policemen, into my offices. And then he sat with me for several hours alone, without policemen and without any handcuffs. And we had a long and serious conversation, sometimes sad, sometimes for him or frightening events, sometimes also were very nice and personal, and even sometimes we laughed together.
Eckert, who lived in the small town of Horf in Germany, had murdered his final victim on November the 2nd, 2006. Local journalist Rainer Meyer remembers the story well.
Volker Eckert hat seine letzte Tat.
Volker Eckert's last victim was the prostitute Milena Petrova near Ostelrich in Catalonia, North Spain.
Nordspanien, Katalonien. Dort hat
He picked her up there and abused her in his lorry. He spent another day driving around.
herumgefahren in der Fahrerkabine. Und am nächsten Morgen.
And the morning after, he dumped her at a nearby stone bridge.
Steinbruch in der Nähe entsorgt.
On the way back from the stone bridge, he was caught on CCTV.
Einer Überwachungskamera.
Somebody was erecting CCTV cameras, which hadn't been there before, and just to test them, panned. One of the images it caught was Eckert's lorry. And when the body that he dumped nearby was found, almost the first place the police went was to look at this entirely accidentally caught CCTV imagery, which led them directly to Eckert.
Eckert's job took him all over the continent. A Europe-wide search was conducted, and on November the 17th, 2006, detectives found him and his truck at a car wash in Cologne.
When they searched the lorry, they found evidence that this was not a one-off act. There were Polaroid photographs of other victims. There were trophies in the lorry. It was perfectly obvious that this was Eckert's lair. Almost every serial killer in one form or another has what's come to be known as a lair. And in his case, it wasn't so much a flat or a cottage or a house. It was the cab of his lorry.
After his arrest, Eckert immediately confessed to a murderous career that had lasted for over 30 years. It was the beginning of a huge international story.
Es waren 5 Morde, 3 in Spanien.
There were 5 murders, 3 in Spain, 2 in France. And from then on, it was a really hot story. As a journalist, you don't have a serial killer very often. And at that point, I tried to get as much information as I could about this person.
Wie möglich über diesen Menschen herauszubekommen.
His story begins over 50 years ago. Volker Eckert was born in the small East German town of Plauen on July the 1st, 1959. From a very young age, he developed a fascination with women's hair.
When he was 9 years old, he started to be fond of the doll of his sister, a doll which had long hair, and he put them in front of him on his bed. He was feeling sexual arousal, plunging his hands into the hair of this doll.
We describe him as a trichophiliac. This is somebody who gains sexual pleasure from hair, essentially. And I think he would have been aware of the fact that this was something odd, this was something out of the ordinary. And I think that would have created a bit of a sense of shame within him. So he was aware that this was something that he had to keep hidden.
As Eckert entered adolescence, his parents' marriage began to break down.
Well, he had quite a turbulent time during his teenage years. His parents divorced, and he reacted really badly to this.
The separation for him was influential because the father had to leave the house, and he said, I swore to myself, that will never happen to me, and I will not marry because I don't want to work all the time and then be thrown out of the house. And he took sides with his father after that. But he continued to live with his mother.
He went off the rails, and one incident involved taking his parents' car and going off on a bit of a joyride. And then he returned home, and he was in a lot of trouble for that. And it wasn't too long after that incident that he actually went and physically attacked and killed one of his classmates.
In 1974, aged just 14, Eckert experienced taking a life for the very first time. But it wasn't until his arrest in November 2006, over 3 decades later, that anyone knew about it.
Volker Eckert hat ja gestanden, dass eine
Volker Eckert confessed to killing a classmate and to disguising her murder as a suicide. And that crime was not solved for years. Or for almost 32 years.
30 Jahre lang nicht geklärt worden.
On May the 7th, 1974, Eckert had knocked on the door of his 14-year-old school friend and neighbour, Sylvia Unterdörfel. Realising her parents weren't home, he took the opportunity of living out the fantasy he'd dreamed of since playing with his sister's doll as a child.
And then he thought, well, I have to do it with a real girl. And he Of course, like many fetishists, they realize they won't do it voluntarily with me, so I have to force them.
She was somebody who had very long, very beautiful hair, and he developed a real fixation, a real obsession with her hair. And he went to where she lived, her home, and basically wormed his way in.
First, this girl only played a role in his fantasy as a victim. But the point came when this fantasy wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to do it. He wanted to stroke her and then kill her.
Und dann auch töten.
He started right away after she let him in, closed the door, and he started getting at her throat and started to strangle her. And when she was unconscious, he plunged his hands into her hair.
Even as a teenager, Eckert had the sophistication to try and disguise the murder.
He strangled her with a clothesline, but he was quite cunning because he thought he needs to cover this up. So what he did is attach the end of the clothesline to a door handle to make it look as if she'd killed herself.
It is physically possible to hang yourself from a doorknob. You don't have to have your full body weight on the neck, and it's something that is occasionally seen, although it's uncommon.
Ihre Mutter, als sie dann von der Arbeit kam, hat die...
Just as her mother was getting home from work, she walked in to find her dead daughter. Of course, like with every unnatural death, the East German investigation authorities began their work and came to the conclusion that it was a suicide.
Es war ein Selbstmord.
At the end, Eckert managed to set up the scene so cleverly that the police fell into his trap.
And for 32 years, right up until Volker Eckert's confession, her parents had lived with the belief that their daughter had taken her own life.
Die spanische Polizei war zu dem Zeitpunkt einfach extrem stolz.
At the time, the Spanish police were extremely proud to have uncovered this series of murders. They wanted publicity. They wanted to be congratulated for their success. They needed a pat on the back. And also wanted to show the public that it was all over. Nothing like this would happen again. We've caught this monster of the highway.
Eckert admitted to the killings of 21-year-old Nigerian Sandra Osivo in 2001 and Polish national Agnieszka Boss in 2006, both in France. Journalist François Barrère could barely believe the scale of the investigation.
We realised that we were dealing with someone who'd been travelling the roads of Europe for 10, 15 years, and that this person had possibly committed crimes, certainly in many European countries. A lot of journalists did the same as the police, namely questioning the existence of case files, of unsolved crimes that might match Volker Eckert's style of killing.
Over the years, Eckert had developed a very familiar MO.
They always started with strangling, and that the woman got unconscious, that he felt the power. He always spoke about to see the consciousness go away from the eyes, and this was his attraction, yeah, to have control and to have power over another person. And to have the fetish with the female hair, with long female hair.
He was a man who had come to have a taste for strangling the life out of women who were not able to protect themselves. He wasn't a particularly big man, he wasn't a huge, strong man, but he was wiry, he was capable, and many of these young women would not have expected to have been treated in this way.
Strangling someone, the main thing that happens is that the blood supply to the brain is cut off. And once that's cut off, then you will lose consciousness in the order of 10 seconds. It takes a lot longer to actually die, but you can render someone unconscious very quickly by strangling them.
Eckert was somebody who became much more skilled at committing murder the longer that his killing went on. So his first murder was quite opportunistic, and it was somebody that he knew. It was incredibly risky, and I think he was very lucky to get away with that. And I think he realised that his luck was on his side at that time. And in later years, he targeted sex workers, because I think there was an awareness there that these people often go off the radar for long periods of time. They're a vulnerable group of people who will get into your lorry willingly. So he had access, he had opportunity, and he really honed his killing routine.
Eckert knew that prostitutes were far less likely to be reported missing immediately, if at all.
Lorry driving was the perfect subterfuge for a man who wished to kill women on the edge of society. He wasn't picking famous people, he wasn't picking rich people, he was picking people who no one would miss.
I think he had a real understanding, a real knowledge of the sex worker community, of how transitory it is, of how temporary it sometimes can be. And he realised that this was easy pickings for him. It wouldn't require much effort to indulge his fantasies and get away with it.
After his arrest in November 2006, Eckert had confessed to 6 murders in total. He appeared to have a complete lack of empathy for his victims.
He's speaking about tremendous, horrible things and details of killing or actually sexually abusing other women, and there was no fear, there was no shivering, there was no turning away of the eyes, there was nothing like a reaction you would expect if a normal person is telling this. I was always asking how you felt when you killed the woman. What did you do the day after? Did you look in the newspaper? Did you think to the parents? Did you think to the family of the girls? His emotions were missing. He spoke about himself like a monster who's not able to control himself, and that he has some defects. He knew this.
Although he admitted taking the lives of 6 women, Eckert still tried to separate himself from the murders.
He spoke about himself in a third person, like he's building a distance between the Mr. Eckert who is committing the crimes and who is really doing horrible things, and the person who is sitting here next to you and speaking with you. So I think this was the way for him to handle this, yeah, because to think that the person who was committing the crime is someone else, because otherwise you cannot live. Yeah? You cannot live with this knowing that you are this monster.
Detectives believe that Eckert had likely committed many more murders over the previous 32 years.
So the investigators are relatively sure that it was probably 13 cases in total, even though it's not possible to prove this 100%. And in a further 6 cases, there was at least the possibility that it was him, because he was driving in the area.
Eckert's movements as a long-distance lorry driver were easy to track, using fuel receipts, GPS records, and details of where he'd spent the night.
Investigators from the whole of Europe dug out their old cases and compared them with the movements of Eckert that the police in Bayreuth had mapped out. And they tried to find crimes that had taken place when Volker Eckert was driving through this country.
Scotland Yard came over to Germany to question. Then there was the French police as well, because every police knew there's a serial killer. So look at the cases where was a woman sexually abused. Maybe this Mr. Eckert was nearby at the time she was killed.
Investigating officers could link Eckert to the murder of 3 more prostitutes between 2002 and 2004 based on his movements. 1 in France, 1 in Italy, and 1 in the Czech Republic. Francois remembers visiting a crime scene that bore all the hallmarks of an Eckert murder.
This was a prostitute who worked near the entrance to a motorway in Montpellier, who disappeared one day and was found 300 kilometers away in a motorway rest area near Montélimar. That's in the area of going back up north, so in other words, potential routes Volker Eckert could have taken when, for example, he returned from Spain to get back to Germany. And this young woman I remember because I used to see her on my way to get a newspaper. She had a very thick head of brown hair, and we knew that Volker Eckert actually had a hair fetish. And this young woman was found dead, stripped naked, in a motorway rest area 300 kilometers from the place where she worked. This matched Volker Eckert's modus operandi exactly. He often moved the victims he had abducted somewhere and killed somewhere else, disposing of the bodies tens of kilometers away to cover his tracks.
Back then, he also committed several more crimes in Plauen. He waylaid women during the night, threw them to the ground and strangled them, but didn't kill them.
18-year-old Eckert was jailed for a year for sexual assault after he was caught strangling a woman in 1978. But it did not curtail him. Between 1979 and 1987, he assaulted dozens more women.
He had attacked several. He talked about 30 women in the dark, so they wouldn't recognize him without killing them. He strangled them, he gripped into their hair, and then he went home and masturbated. That was for several years, well, more than 2 at least, but he said 30, maybe more, attacks against women like that in his hometown.
There are no official records of how many women survived or died after Eckert's attacks. He was finally stopped in 1987 after he assaulted 2 women in Plauen and left them for dead. Both were able to identify him to police. One of those women, whose name we have changed to protect her identity, is Claudia, who was only 16 at the time.
Ich war auf dem Heimweg von einer Party.
I was on the way home from a party together with my friend.
Und auf dem Heimweg
I took her home first and wanted to walk the rest of the way by myself. As I continued to walk alone, I noticed after around 100 meters that somebody was following me. When I walked faster, the person behind me also walked faster, and when I slowed down, also he was slowing down. At that point, I already felt a bit threatened, so I grabbed my bunch of keys, hoping to be able to defend myself. Maybe I could hit him in the face.
Und bin weitergegangen. Und an einer Straßenkreuzung.
He suddenly came up behind me at a crossroads and pushed me to the ground. Then he put his hands around my neck and choked me. I then tried to defend myself, but he was stronger, heavier, more powerful. I had no chance. I tried to play dead in the hope that he would let go, but that didn't work.
Aber auch das ist nicht gelungen. Kniete dann.
He knelt on top of my legs, so there was no chance for me to move anywhere. He was strangling me with his hands. I really struggled to describe it, this pain and the pressure. It was very brutal and incredibly violent. At that moment, I gave up my life. That was it. I knew it was over. I saw a tunnel with a white light at the end of it. It was really like that, a near-death experience.
Incredibly, Claudia survived the attack and was able to give a detailed description of her attacker to the police.
To this day, I still can't forget his face.
Eckert had applied to leave communist East Germany behind and move to the freedom of the West. But when a drawing of Claudia's description of his face was distributed amongst the police, an officer recognized him, and he was immediately arrested before he could flee the country.
The day of his court hearing arrived, when he was about to be convicted. He was sitting only a few meters away from me, and suddenly he apologized to me. For me, well, there can be no excuse for a crime like this.
In 1988, Eckert was sentenced to 12 years in prison for attempted murder. During his time behind bars, he underwent therapy for his sexual deviance, which the prison authorities saw as a success.
The doctor or the psychologist who saw him was very certain that Volker Eckert could control his sexual urges from then on. And this was apparently supposed to have been ensured, as he was supposed to undergo more therapy when he made it out of prison. But he didn't do it.
Unbelievably, Eckert served just 6 years of his sentence, and in 1994 he was released into the world yet again. And he headed straight for the woman who put him behind bars.
Stand eines Nachts vor der Tür.
One night, he was standing in front of my door. He rang the bell wearing a boiler suit, one of these blue ones, and said, "There is a burst pipe, you must let me in." I had a little peephole in the door, a tiny little hole where I could look through, and there I recognized him.
Weiß aber, dass es war.
I did not open the door, but I know it was him. He tried to find me. I don't want to know what he wanted to do with me. Now it's over, thank God, but he definitely wanted to attack again.
Hat definitiv noch mal angreifen wollen.
By 1994, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and Eckert was free to travel wherever he wanted.
After he got out of prison, he was able to slip through the net of the authorities. He was able to give them as much as they wanted, but not too much, to see that there's a dangerous person who is still dangerous for the society, who is still running through life with this, let's call it disease, with these criminal obsessions.
Wir haben die Frauen leid getan.
I felt sorry for the women, because while he had been in prison, psychologists and other similar professionals would have actually realized that he was still a danger to society. But because of the reunification of Germany, he was released, and nobody seemed to care. Even though he was a tried murderer, he was let go without any sort of assessment, and the women could all still be alive if only someone had acted differently.
Anders reagiert hätte.
Eckert settled in the small town of Hof, just 20 miles from Plauen.
So he had landed on his feet in Hof and settled in well, and was well liked. His landlady also said she had rarely encountered such a nice tenant, and everyone was completely flabbergasted when they found out just what sorts of crimes Volker Eckert had committed, despite everyone considering him to be a nice guy.
By 1999, 40-year-old Eckert had taken a job as a long-distance lorry driver, a profession that suited the killer perfectly.
It allows them to go off the radar for quite extended periods of time. They work unsupervised, they don't answer to anybody, and they have these long stretches of time to ruminate and to basically get lost in their own thoughts. So that creates an environment in which their fantasies start to become a reality. And then when they do offend, we often find that they can dump the bodies of their victims in a completely different police jurisdiction to the one that they picked them up in. And that creates something called linkage blindness within the police who are investigating these crimes. They don't always connect them immediately.
When police finally caught up with him in 2006, Eckert's truck was like a shrine to his victims. Photos and hair clippings had been collected in his cab.
They were his trophies, if you like, along with hair and various other things. They represented for him the reason. The body itself was disposable, but that memory and that lock of hair or locks of hair were his explanation to himself about why he was doing it. That was what he was there for.
Auf diese Polaroid-Fotos
He also made notes of the details of each crime on the back of these Polaroid pictures, so that he could later remind himself of what had happened in each attack.
He kept
the prostitute's hair in little plastic bags, having cut it off after the crime. He kept items of clothing, but the owners of some items of clothing still haven't been determined today.
Manchen weiß man bis heute nicht, zu wem die gehören.
Ce qui a tout de suite attiré l'attention.
What caught our attention straight away was the fact that the killer was a fetishist. In other words, this was someone who kept souvenirs of their crimes, who took things from their victims. including locks of hair, things like that, keeping things, souvenirs, fetishes, keeping them in a kind of, like some kind of treasure. He is the kind of character you don't find too often in European crime stories, and in this case, we were almost imagining a film character.
On avait vraiment l'impression presque d'un personnage de cinéma, quoi.
He created a little repository, essentially, and this is something that's quite common for serial killers, and it serves several functions for them. So it enables them to relive their crimes, to revisit that moment when they were all-powerful and fully in control. But it also acts as a bit of a stimulus to do it again. So it really is a vicious circle when it comes to trophies.
La plupart des criminels, ils se débarrassent.
Most criminals get rid of any evidence that could link them to their victim. This guy, he kept it all. And that alone is something you hardly ever see in criminal cases.
Prosecutors had sent Eckert to be assessed by forensic psychologist Professor Norbert Niederpil, and the killer seemed to open up during the sessions.
In the end, he said, well, for several months, I was very withdrawn in myself. Now I could even laugh and I was freer. He said, I'm glad I talked to you. The 3 or 4 days that we were together, he said, I slept better, I talked better, I was more relaxed than usual.
Professor Niederpil analysed Eckert's psychological condition for the upcoming court case.
The actual conclusion is that he is psychiatrically a sadist. A sadism developed from fetishism, and this, in the legal sense, is a mental disorder. And this mental disorder would lead to a diminished responsibility concerning the sexual acts, but not the killings that have been done to prevent detection. And that he would be a repeat offender, and if released, even after a prison sentence, would not stop it.
He was really preoccupied with what other people thought of him, and he was being portrayed in a way that he didn't think was fair. He's been committing these crimes for over 30 years, and I think he's developed quite a grandiose sense of self. And when he's reduced to the label of a monster, he's really not happy about that at all.
For local journalists in Horth, the trial of this perverse killer, due to take place in the local courthouse, was set to be a huge story.
Ja, jede Schlagzeile ist gut für eine Zeitung und jede spektakuläre.
Every headline is good for a newspaper, and every spectacular story is good for a newspaper. And it isn't the newspaper's fault that it interests people.
Alles, was nicht normal ist.
But everything that isn't normal stirs people. And if someone living in a community finds out that the nice uncle was not actually the nice uncle that everyone thought he was, but a perverse serial killer, then that stirs people too. And then they want to know as much as possible about it. And we are there for the purpose of delivering that information.
Menschen auch, und dann wollen die möglichst viel darüber wissen und diese Information zu liefern, dafür sind wir da.
While waiting for his trial in custody, Eckert had lost the support of his family.
I remember very well, he was very desperate that he had completely lost the contact to his family, because his sister was always a very important point of contact for him through his whole life, and she didn't want to have contact with him.
Dann saß also in Bayreuth in dieser Justizvollzugsanstalt.
He was sitting inside his cell in the prison of Bayreuth and had a lot of time to think.
An seinem 48. Geburtstag.
On his 48th birthday, the 1st of July 2007, he knew that he would be officially charged with murder within the next few days.
Dass als Mörder angeklagt werden wird.
Nobody came to see him that day. His sister didn't visit, and neither did his brother.
Andere Familie, sein Bruder nicht.
It all became too much for him. On the night of his 48th birthday, July the 1st, 2007, Volker Eckert was left alone in his cell. The following morning, his body was found hanging from the bars.
War ganz allein und in dieser
He was all alone, and during the night he brought justice to himself and hanged himself in the cell.
In der Zelle.
It would seem rather strange that here we have somebody who was obsessed with harming other people by strangulation, and he makes a decision to take his own life by the same means. And it is a way to end your life when you're in prison, and it's not difficult to get hold of items to achieve that outcome.
Eckert's death meant he would escape justice. It came as a surprise to the people who'd got to know him better than most.
I talked to him about suicide at several occasions, and he said several times, I'm a coward, I won't do it. But I know that I have no chances.
If you ask me how I feel about him, I cannot say I like him. But you're a human being and you are in contact with this man. I never see him killing someone, I only read this. But you have contact, you see him 3 times a week, and you see how he's reacting, and you feel how all the court, all the authority of the state is against him, how the press is calling him a monster, a murderer. In this way, he doesn't deserve this treatment also in the public. And he deserves, for sure, a fair trial, and to defend him as best as you can. And I felt sad when I heard that he killed himself, because you develop a relationship also with your clients in prison, especially when you take over the case for such a long time. You develop a relationship, and he ended this in a way that, like he ended other lives, he ended his own life himself.
Claudia, who survived a brutal attack by Eckert in 1987, had been planning to attend his trial.
Als ich einen Telefonanruf bekam von einem Journalisten.
When I got a call from a journalist telling me that Volker Eckert had killed himself, my first thought was coward. A coward who is dodging responsibility for the gruesome acts he committed.
Die grausigen Taten, die begangen.
After a considerable amount of time, I was then running out of accusations.
War ich dann am Ende.
I had come to terms with the situation and was even glad that he had killed himself, because this gruesome human could no longer hurt anyone.
Keine mehr zu Schaden kommen.
Auf der einen Seite, glaube ich, war es.
On the one hand, I believe it was simply the best solution and the fairest solution. As if he wanted to say, I'm taking my own life, just like the lives I have already taken. But on the other hand, a lot of things that haven't yet been explained will never be clarified.
Hätte geklärt werden können, nie geklärt werden.
There were many questions still to be asked about Volker Eckert's crimes. His death means they will remain unanswered.
Lorsqu'on a appris la mort de Volker Eckert,
I had a feeling of frustration above all.
parce que j'ai compris qu'on ne connaîtrait exactement.
I knew that Volker Eckert's death meant the end of any investigations that could have been reopened on the old case files that no one was interested in anymore,
Pu être réouverte sur ces vieux dossiers.
and which had only reappeared in police and media news.
C'est revenu dans l'actualité policière et médiatique. Ces mystères-là.
In the end, these mysteries would never be solved. And that is what's truly shocking about the death of Volker Eckert, that those victims will never be granted justice.
Ces victimes-là n'auront jamais justice.
In December 2007, 5 months after his death, police closed the file on Volker Eckert. The Europe-wide investigation was over.
Und hat sich an viele Taten sehr gut und
He could remember many of his crimes very well, and indeed very precisely.
Und das wäre natürlich für die Presse ein.
Surely that would have been a massively exciting trial for the press, and of course also for the readers, who would have wanted to keep up with the news. The trial would have taken months, with enormous coverage from international media, because the crimes had been committed across half of Europe.
Dadurch, dass die Taten in halb Europa verübt wurden.
Just how many helpless women were killed at the hands of Eckert may never be known.
I'm quite sure that there was no gap of time where he didn't do anything. So, because he always spoke about himself as someone who is not able to control the desire and his obsession. So, if you ask my personal opinion, I think there's a high percentage that he did more than he admitted to. Yes.
Das wird immer das Rätsel.
There will always be the question whether 6 dead women, or whether 13, or even 19, or even more. He has taken this mystery with him forever.
Dieses Geheimnis.
There have been estimates of 22 across Europe, France, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Spain. He was relentless and he was successful in evading the attentions of the police for a very considerable period of time.
The shadow of Volker Eckert remains not just over the women he murdered, but also the ones that got away.
There will always be a part of me that will probably never forget. I can't imagine it. I experienced it. I know what I had to go through.
Volker Eckert was a relentless, predatory serial killer, preying on vulnerable women. He took pleasure in it. He took a great deal of sexual satisfaction from it. He was a man who deserves the epithet evil.
Eckert was a callous murderer who showed no remorse for his actions. He took the life of a 14-year-old girl for his own gratification before embarking on a 32-year-long killing spree. It will never be revealed exactly how many young women he murdered. By cowardly taking his own life, Volker Eckert robbed many families of justice and proved himself to be one of the world's most evil killers.